If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. Well, welcome back to the Considering Catholicism podcast. My name is Greg. I'm your host, and I am sitting out here in the piney woods by the shore of Lake Michigan with Ed the Protestant.
Where the temp has dropped about 10 degrees since we got out here.
Stop whining.
Yeah. Look, I'm the one wearing the lightweight shirt and the...
It's a big, thick flannel lumberjack shirt. You're a lumberjack, and that's okay.
Well, let's not go there.
Let's not go there, but we'll survive. We'll survive.
Right.
It's a reminder not to talk too long on this episode.
Right, and I'm getting hungry. So
and it's getting close to 4:00 in the afternoon. As we get older, we start eating dinner.
That's a standard dinner time.
At 4:00 in the afternoon,
which sounded so dumb to me when I was younger, and now I'm like, well, that makes perfect sense.
As we become men of a certain age, right? We didn't get your afternoon nap today because we were out here, but anyway, we're sitting in the piney woods. Hey, before we get into Ed's question, would all of you listening do me a favor? Push the pause button on this episode right now if you can, and go to whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on, either Apple or Spotify. Those are our 2 biggest sources of downloads. And would you rate it for me? The rating of the podcast really helps us to not only move up in search rankings, but it qualifies us for certain endorsements and support and sponsorships, and they need to see it rated. And I know that we are approaching about 10,000 downloads a month, and that we've got about 80 people that have rated the podcast. And so it would mean a lot to me if you would go to one of those platforms and just hit the rating and be honest, but I would rather it be closer to 5 stars than 1. But would you mind giving a rating? And then if you are on Apple Podcasts or have access to it, would you write a review there? Because again, those reviews, the number of them and the quality of them, again, kind of qualifies us to move up in search engines and to qualify for sponsorships and endorsements and things like that. So do me a favor, do me a solid, and rate and review. Okay, with that pleading out of the way, let's turn back to Ed, who is starting to shiver in front of me. But I'm going to energize him because I'm going to give him the stick. I mean, the control of the plane here, right? Yeah. Or maybe it's like the big wheel of the bus.
It's going to go to my head.
One of those buses where they have like the giant steering wheel that's almost flat, horizontal. You've got the steering wheel because there's something that you wanted to talk about. And I'm going to let you steer the bus, and I'm just going to jump in or answer questions as you go along.
Okay. I want to talk about hierarchy. It's been on my mind. We've been talking about mystical things, and I don't know what got me going down this road, but I was thinking about it, that the concept of hierarchy is everywhere in front of us, okay? The animal kingdom, there's a whole hierarchy. Like Woody Allen said, the world is a big restaurant and everybody's eating everybody. There's an obvious hierarchy. Like I just saw a thing about these wildebeests fighting each other to be head of their what is it, a group of wildebeests, because somebody had to be at the top. The world we live in, though, attempts are being made to make it flatter and flatter and flatter, okay? There's the word patriarchy is now something that is often snarled out of somebody's mouth. The thought, which I think of as so American, is nobody can tell me what to do. And I don't see that reflected as much in the culture as I used to. An example would be architecture. When I was a kid, we used to go down. I lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and my mom would take the bus and go pay our utility bills at the city hall, which was this huge, ornate castle-looking thing, and it just oozed authority. Okay, it's not like going to some one-story glass and brick thing, and I miss that about modern society, and I don't like seeing things going in the other direction. So, as I approach Catholicism, I see that Catholicism supports this. We just talked in another episode we recorded today about the hierarchy in the spiritual world, Michael and the archangels and Satan and the demons. And this feels like something we just can't get away from, and that it's important. I like the feeling. One of the things that draws me to Catholicism is the hierarchy. Jesus giving out authority to the apostles and it being handed down, that appeals to me much more than the sort of a flat world of Protestantism. But there are pitfalls here, I think. In the modern world, you've got to be careful what you say, but there's a drive to make everybody equal and everything flat, and I just don't see that as the real world, you know? So I thought maybe you could talk about that hierarchy and the Catholic Church and hierarchy and maybe the natural world. I can't believe that you don't have more thoughts about this than me. That'd be disappointing. So what say ye about this?
Well, as I am often wont to do, let's go back to the etymology of the word hierarchy in the Greek, okay? Because I think that's going to be insight into this. So the English word hierarchy comes from two Greek root words, hieros, which means sacred or holy, and archein, which means to rule. So the original Greek concept here is a sort of sacred ordering.
Okay.
That things are ordered according to their sacred position.
Okay.
Okay. So in the original Greek world, you might say, hey, there is an ordering of spiritual powers, things that are more or less holy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay. There is a ladder of being, a ladder of importance in the universe. And a little bit that gets reflected, to go on a little bit of a tangent, in the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, who would talk about some of these things in terms of contingency as well. So contingency is one thing exists because something else exists.
Okay, yeah.
Right? So, for example, we're all sitting here at the secret compound around this table, and if the earth didn't exist, we wouldn't be able to sit on it. But this earth only exists because it's moving around the sun, and the sun only exists because of the galaxy. And so all of these things have this sort of sacred ordering that one thing causes the other. And of course, Aquinas says, if you follow that chain of contingency back to its source, to the one thing that doesn't need anything else to exist, that is the source of all things, of all being, that's God. You with me?
Yep.
So hierarchy, by the very word and the etymology, implies a sort of sacred or eternal ordering of things. With me?
Yep.
Now, that's very different than us thinking in terms of power structures within the world.
Okay, yeah.
So when we think of power structures in the world, that has to do with, well, at the end of the day, guns and money.
Right.
Who's got the lawyers, guns, and money?
Right.
There's a great old, what is it, Warren Zevon? Send lawyers, guns, and money?
I don't remember that one. But
oh, yeah. There's a classic, I think, Warren Zevon song called Send Lawyers, Guns, and Money. But right, at the end of the day, power structures are based on who has the guns, who has the money, and who has the lawyers. And they rule everybody else.
Yep.
Okay? So when the kind of hierarchy that you're talking about, that you sense in the church, that you sense in architecture, that you sense in nature, is not about lawyers, guns, and money. It's not about power in that sense. It's about this eternal structure and ordering of the universe. And so when you look at that architecture, like when you talked about going down to those beautiful buildings, there's a sense in which the things that we build should reflect the sacred ordering of the universe.
Yes.
And what do we talk about all the time on the podcast? And we talk about in the introduction to the podcast, in a little intro, and that is truth, goodness, and beauty, which are the three transcendentals that the Catholic Church talks about. And there is a sacred ordering of things that are true and things that are good and things that are beautiful. Now, if you turn the clock back in time, There was a sense that if we were going to build things, make things, structure things, live, we wanted our lives, we wanted our families, we wanted our art, we wanted our architecture, we wanted our ceremonies, we wanted all of these things to reflect the sacred ordering of truth, goodness, and beauty in, in the universe. In other words, those things are reflecting the true and eternal nature of things. Like, we build ugly buildings today.
Yeah.
we build ugly churches. We build ugly buildings. You and I have talked about this all the time. So you go look at go look at one of the great cathedrals, and then you go look at your strip mall, the kind of churches that you and I worked in, where it was a big box.
They look like banks.
It looks like a bank or a big box building or something. And they've all devolved to functionality.
Yeah.
And to some degree, they've devolved to power structures. Because it's like, how can we deliver content? How do we move people through? How do we do these things, rather than saying, when I walk into this place, you walk into one of the great cathedrals, go into Chartres Cathedral in France or something, with the stained glass and the sacred architecture and the arches and the Gothic architecture, and everybody goes there is moved. They look up and they go, oh, this is true and good and beautiful. And it feels like that building is reflecting the eternal realities.
You're drawn to a truth.
Yeah.
You're drawn to a truth that you can't maybe articulate, but you can feel it. I felt that in the cathedral you took me to.
Yeah. And the same thing with beauty. What we've said about the three transcendentals, truth and goodness and beauty, is that those are eternal qualities of God. And so everything that God creates in his universe is reflective of those. And that means that if you find anything in this world that is true, if you find anything in this world that is beautiful, and if you find anything in this world that is good, and you trace it back to its source, like following the river until it becomes a creek, and a creek till it's a stream, and whatever, up to its source, it will always lead you back to God. And so when you talk about these hierarchies in the church, whether that's how the church is structured, how the church is designed, how the liturgy of the church looks, how our lives are put together, there is a right desire for the things that we do in this world to reflect those eternal realities. And it is the materialism of the modern world. And by that, I don't just mean that we go buy a lot of stuff, right? I mean, materialism, Black Friday. But what it is the belief that there's nothing beyond this physical world. Materialism is the notion that just what you can see, feel, and touch is all there is. And materialism then lends itself to either power structures, the lawyers, guns, and money thing, right? Who has the power? Or functionality, utilitarianism. If we're going to build something, how do we get as many people in the seats, move as many people through the parking lot, right? I love going to Chick-fil-A because Chick-fil-A is amazing, the drive-through and the logistics. I mean, this is like, but at the same time, that's the triumph of functionalism and utilitarianism. And it's amazing that we can all move through the Chick-fil-A drive-through like that, but look what we're missing. Back in the day, you would go into a beautiful space and eat a beautiful meal surrounded by beautiful things, and there was a sacred order to it all. And the meal was supposed to reflect eternal truths, and we're supposed to live our lives. It's like what we were doing here was a microcosm of the bigger realities.
It's like when I was a kid, we didn't travel by air, but people dressed up to travel by air. And my parents, we didn't eat out very much when I was a kid, but when we did, I had to dress up a little bit.
Yeah. Again, there's a sense of dignity. And then what you're talking about is the lowering of things rather than the aspiration for us to see the world behind us. You took that Dante course that I taught a few years ago, and we saw that in Dante's Divine Comedy, that the universe from the top to the bottom is this ordered reality that reflects the truth and goodness and beauty that are inherent in God and then proceed throughout into his creation.
Right.
And again, when we flatten that, to use your word, we sort of strip it away and reduce things down to materialism, to power, to utilitarianism, to what's effective. I remember when I was in the evangelical world and I was working with architects who built buildings. I'll tell you a story about that. I'll tell you two stories about church architecture, okay? This was like 20 years ago. For a while, I worked a little bit on and off with a guy who was fairly famous in the evangelical church architecture world.
Okay.
He designed a lot of very famous contemporary evangelical church buildings and campuses, and written up in magazines, big conference speaker, kind of a big deal guy. And I got to know him, worked a little bit with him, I wouldn't say we were friends, but friendly acquaintances and professional acquaintances. And I remember as I was starting down my Road to Rome journey, a moment that was a huge sort of, inflection point. That's a fancy word, right?
I like it.
But inflection point or tipping point for me on my Road to Rome journey. So here's what had happened. This guy and I were Facebook friends, and he had posted an article on Facebook about a Catholic church. It may have been a cathedral or just an elegant old Catholic church in Europe. I think it was in Germany or Belgium or something. And it had been converted into a coffee shop brew house.
Mm.
And so he was like, man, look what they did. They went in and they got rid of a lot of like the altar and all this stuff in the middle and the seats. And then they built like these cool levels that you could sit on with like steel diamond plate and all this kind of modernistic stuff that sort of sits in there on these platforms. You go in there and you get a beer or a cool coffee and then sit in there and have a sandwich or something, and you're kind of suspended on diamond plate steel platforms in the middle of this church with the stained glass windows around you, and you're over the space where the altar used to be, and it's just really cool. You could have a cool beer there, and he's like, man, this is just awesome. Isn't this great architecture? And I remember I was a good ways down on my Road to Rome at that point.
Yep.
And I think I private messaged him on Facebook, and I said, man, I really struggle with that. I won't say his name. I'll call him Bob. I go, hey, Bob, I really struggle with that because that was a sacred space.
Yeah.
And it feels weird to reduce a sacred space. He goes, yeah, but it's a better use of the space today and more functional and commerce and blah, blah, blah. And I pushed back and we had this little thing in Facebook Messenger. And I was like, yeah, but it's a sacred space. And here's where I want to go with this. He said, spaces aren't sacred. They're just spaces. He says it's a building. It's a beautiful old building that at one point has pretty architecture, has pretty stained glass and cool lines, but there's no such thing as a sacred space. He's like, we do things and we make spaces sacred by what we do in them. Spaces themselves aren't sacred. And this Facebook Messenger dialogue we had, I went, I'm losing it, or I'm losing him, or I'm being lost to that movement. Because again, not everything is just a box that a black box or a white box that we just decide we're going to have a band in or a coffee shop in, or we're going to use it for church today or a brewery tomorrow. Back to your point about the building you used to go pay the utility bill at.
Right.
Buildings and spaces used to reflect these eternal hierarchies and eternal realities of truth, goodness, and beauty. And in that sense, hierarchy is this sort of sacred ordering of things. Yeah. So that was the one. And then my second quick story about that was after my conversion to Catholicism, I entered the church. I had an occasion to take my daughter to Italy with me. I was going over there for a reason, and I got a chance to take her along with me. She had not entered the Catholic Church at that point. She was in college. So I took my daughter over there. We had a great time. We toured all around. We went to Rome and Assisi and Florence and all these places. And I showed her all of these amazing churches and basilicas and, dragged her through everything. Anyway, fast forward, we get back and we'd been back a few weeks and Sunday rolled around. And of course, I was going to the Catholic Church. She's in college. And she says, well, I'm going to go to the contemporary evangelical megachurch where I had been attending while I was in college with my friends. And so she goes that Sunday, and it's the kind of place that you and I used to work, that had a band and a colored lights and a fog machine and the whole nine yards. And you're sitting in theater seats in a big black room. Right. And I saw her a few days later and I said, oh, so how was it? And she said, I'm like, what's wrong? And she goes, you ruined it for me. And I go, what? And she goes, well, once you've been to church in St. Peter's Basilica, everything else just seems lame.
Yeah.
And I was like, yes.
Yeah.
But is that sense that there is a sacred order of being, and the things that we build and create, and the ways that we live, and the ways that we pattern our lives, and the ways that we organize ourselves, and the ways that we dress, and the ways that we conduct ourselves ought to reflect that sacred order. And where it gets mistaken is people think of hierarchy and they mistake it for the power structures that I was talking about earlier, that some people have power over others. And that's not what it is. I don't look at our parish priest or our bishop or even the Pope as somebody who's more powerful than me. I look at them as occupying an office and a space that is God ordained. It's not an exercise of power. I don't know. Did I answer your?
Yeah, it's a big topic, and I think it's just so obvious once I start looking at it. It's just so obvious everywhere, and to me that's all very comforting. I like being small in it. You know, it's a comforting feeling.
I'm going to tell you another story since I'm now telling old anecdotes that got me in trouble in seminary. And I remember I was sitting in some class. I don't remember which class it was. It was like a systematic theology class or something. And I can't even remember exactly what we were talking about, but somehow we were talking about how the church is organized, right? And of course, this was a Calvinist seminary, so they had a Presbyterian organization, very flat, democratic, like what you're talking about, right? The church is ruled by basically these conventions or synods of pastors and lay elders who get together and have like this little Congress or legislature where they vote on everything. And somehow we're having this rigorous class discussion, and everyone's talking about church ecclesial structures or something or other, and I raised my hand, which was a mistake, and I said something that really, I choose my words carefully, ticked off, you can use a more colorful word, that ticked off my professor, because before going to seminary, I had done graduate work in philosophy and all this stuff, and I'd read all this goofball stuff because I was at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and it was Boulder and all that, and I had taken a couple of classes in Eastern and Chinese philosophy, and I'd read a little bit of that. And I raised my hand and I said, there's this principle in Confucianism, in Chinese Confucianism, when they came to Confucius and they said, the empire is falling apart. The nation is falling apart. There's wars and floods and famines and, I don't know, giant earthworms coming out of the
dogs
ground.
And cats living together.
Dogs and cats living together and all that kind of stuff. Everything is in chaos. And they said, what should we do? And Confucius said, rectify names. And what that meant was, let the emperor be emperor, let the farmer be farmer, let the soldier be soldier, let the housewife be housewife, let the artisan be an artisan. And this notion was that there is this sacred order, and that if everybody will, in a sense, what did Bill Belichick with the New England Patriots always like, do your job. If everybody understood their place in the eternal sacred dance and fulfilled their vocation, So I made this point that, and I still think it's a valid point, that, and Thomas Aquinas would agree that even the pagans recognize, or are able by reason to recognize, and Paul says this in Romans chapter 1, that there's this common grace that it's evident by simply looking at the moon and the stars and the created universe, they can learn natural law truths, right? So this is just basically the truths of natural law that even Confucius could recognize, that we all have a place in the great sacred order and the great sacred dance. And that if all of us would learn to occupy our space and do it and fulfill our vocation, that the world would work better than it does. So anyway, I raise my hand and I say this in class, and everybody in the class turns to me because I'm the guy who come from Boulder, and I used to have like a weird haircut, and for a while I had a hoop earring and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, I'm spouting off this goofy Confucius stuff in the Calvinist seminary and rectify names and natural laws, and I'm talking, and I dropped some stuff about Thomas Aquinas and natural law. And then they began to doubt that I maybe didn't belong in this seminary.
Some kind of papist or something.
Well, yeah. I mean, I got myself in trouble. But anyway, I stand by the point, and that is that I think even, as Paul says in Romans 1, for even the pagans can look at the natural universe and recognize truth, goodness, and beauty, and recognize natural law, and recognize the sacred order of things. And again, we want not only our lives to reflect that. Why wouldn't we want our buildings to reflect that? Why wouldn't we want our art to reflect that? Why wouldn't we want our liturgies and ceremonies to reflect that? I mean, why is it that public ceremonies and public activity tries to follow ceremony and order?
Yeah.
Right? Because if everything at the end of the day is just lawyers, guns, and money. And I feel like it's not just that our world is becoming, or our country today, our culture is being reduced in a horizontal way. I think it's falling down to just power dynamics.
Yeah.
What's right and how do we do things? Who has the lawyers and guns and money to pull it off?
The idea that there's order in the universe that God has set up and that I have a place in it somewhere, that feels very freeing. That's freedom. I'm not called to be a mathematician. I'm a musician. That's kind of the thing that God has made me good at. And maybe that's just enough. I shouldn't worry that I'm not whatever I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, it's for each of us to find our vocation and our place and to be what God made us to be. And that's not a uniquely Catholic notion. But I think where Catholicism takes this is that then becomes reflected in every other aspect of our life, and particularly in Catholicism, in the church. Right? So that goes back to the church architecture. That goes back to the liturgy. That goes back to the structure of the church. That goes back to the way that we live our lives, that it becomes reflective of the sacred ordering of things and the hierarchy of being, and to be fully reflective of God's truth, goodness, and beauty. You and I talked in that episode where you were responding to Doug the Protestant about how the Reformation broke a lot of that when they went in and smashed the stained glass windows and stripped out the altars and stripped out the art and stripped out the architecture and began to build these stark spaces for Bible lectures.
Right. Yeah.
With the notion that that's all we needed to do was to have Bible lectures. And then you can go back to parts of Europe and see where there were these beautiful Catholic churches that were converted into these Protestant, especially Calvinist lecture halls.
Yeah.
And that comes right down to it. Whether it's like you said with your mom going and paying the utility bill, there was a time when we built beautiful things because they were supposed to be beautiful. And again, I would argue that one of the great crises of our country right now is the reduction of everything to functionalism or power structures. Yep. And honestly, I don't know if anybody's paying attention to current events, but we're not even doing very well on functionalism. Like things aren't even functional. Other than the drive-through at Chick-fil-A, it's about the only thing in this country that works anymore functionally. But other than that, everything is simply, whether it's our politics, our economics, the way we do business, the way that we live together in communities, the way people interact, it is a reduction to structures of power. Mm-hmm. And that's what irritates me, is that when people try to imply or argue or assert or whatever, that the sacred hierarchies of the church, whether that's in the art, the architecture, the liturgy, the clergy, the this, that, everything, the prayers, everything that we do, that sacred ordering are merely power structures, because they don't understand that they all came out of a world thousands of years ago, and over thousands of years, in which people were focused on trying to make the things that we do in this world reflect the truth and goodness and beauty of the created order.
Yeah.
And what is seen and unseen that God has made, right? I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of all that is seen and unseen. And I want the things that we do in this world to reflect that. So even if it's designing a bank, or it's how we live our lives and how we structure everything, I want it to be reflective of that. So,
well, that's what I wanted to hear. That's wonderful.
Well, did we answer it?
I think we did. That was a good discussion.
Okay, good. Well, now the sun has come out a little bit more.
Right.
So, but we're in the shade. So let's turn this off, move over towards the sunny area.
Right.
And then hopefully that will warm you up a bit.
My lips won't be blue anymore.
Yeah. Hey, and if you want to write in, send an email, send us your questions, your stories, just send them to consideringcatholicism@gmail.com. Go to the website, leave a message, support us there, do whatever. All the episodes are archived there, consideringcatholicism.com. Join us soon for the next episode.
Yeah, it'll be great.